Okay, everyone. I see a lot of people in the back without seats. There are a couple of seats up here in the front rows, and we're bringing as many out as we can. Good to see people excited about Constitution Day, and it's 2 days before Constitution Day. So we're going to start here in a second. Please do try to find a seat. We'll leave those doors open so everyone can hear. Okay, everybody. Welcome to the Constitution Day Lecture. I'm Jay Sexton. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the new director of the Kinder Institute of Constitutional Democracy. I'm just going to say a few words about the Kinder Institute, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker, and we'll have the main event, which clearly there's much anticipation for. So it's wonderful to see so many people here. For those of you who don't know the Kinder Institute, we're an interdisciplinary unit here on campus devoted to the research and teaching of the American founding, the formation of the United States, but then also the reverberations of the American founding, forward in time and outward in space, looking at constitutional democracy as a new thing in the world after the mid-18th century. We put on a lot of events like this. We put dozens of speaking events each semester, so check out our website. But tonight is an important one. This is one of our annual highlights, our annual James Fleming and Linda McClain Constitution Day Lecture. And I want to thank Jim and Linda for supporting the Kinder Institute and this annual lecture through a very generous donation to make it possible. So we give them a round of applause. I think they'll be watching online. I also want to thank this event tonight. We're partnering with the Black Studies Department, Dave Dunkley, and also the Middleton Institute. I think I saw David Mitchell walking around earlier, and it's great to partner with those institutes and departments, and we look forward to more collaboration over time. So thank you very much. Finally, in addition to the research that we do and the guest speaker series, what we're really here for, the Kinder Institute, is for you, the students. I see a lot of students here. We're here for you. We want to give you opportunities. We have a major, we have a minor, we do study abroad programs, we do internship programs, we've got an MA. We want to provide Missouri students with the best opportunities possible. So it's boom times for the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy right now. Of course, there's a paradox to that. Constitutional democracy itself is on the ropes. It's good that we have a lighthearted audience. That's a serious point, but it is a total bummer and something that we think a lot about. What can we do? How can we do our bit to make things better? And I think one thing we can do is to provide a platform for good people who are doing things to make our constitutional democracy a better place and a better system. And we're joined certainly by one of those people here tonight, our distinguished Constitution Day lecturer, Lynne Jackson, the founding director of the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation, and also the great-granddaughter of Harriet and Dred Scott. She is someone who, when you think things look bad, when you read the newspaper, get on her website, and you'll think, actually, there are people trying to make a difference. Her work at the Dred Scott Foundation has shown diverse audiences that the problems of the present are rooted in the problems of the past. She's made clear that we can't reconcile our differences today until we come to terms with the injustices of yesterday. And she's made clear that understanding the complexities of the past is the necessary prerequisite to commemorating the things that ought to be remembered so that we are a better, more just society in the future. Now, what I just did there with those points, students, don't ever do what I just did. I shamelessly plagiarized from the Dred Scott Heritage Foundation. Every single email I've had from Lynne, at the very bottom, it has the 3 pillars. I don't know if I should say this now, but commemoration, education, and reconciliation. And these are the pillars that have been behind the work of our speaker tonight, all the wonderful things that they've done. I'm sure many of you have seen the statue of Dred and Harriet Scott, which the foundation helped or led the way to put up in front of the old courthouse in St. Louis in 2012. Many of you will have heard Lynne speak, as have I, or maybe encountered some of the education programs that the foundation has encouraged in our schools. And the work continues with a brand new exhibit, actually, that's running right now. I don't know if it's running today, but it's running right now in Chesterfield, a visual exhibit on the many faces of Dred Scott. So I hope many of you can check that out if you're driving that way. Okay, enough from me. You don't want to hear from me. We want to hear from Lynne Jackson. Let's give a warm Missouri and Kinder Institute welcome to Lynne Jackson.
Thank you. I'll hold it. Thank you. Thank you. Wow, we're impressed tonight. Thank you so much for coming out. I am always bewildered and astonished myself that so many people still want to know about the old story of Dred Scott. And of course, it is old, but at the same time, it's new, because in so many ways, since we started our foundation in 2007, we have discovered things that our family actually didn't know or had wrong because of genealogy. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful run for me, and I don't really see an end in sight. But tonight I'm going to have the opportunity to add a little bit more than I normally do. I usually just have enough time to share the highlights and talk about foundation. But because this is a Constitution lecture, I am throwing in a few extra points about the Constitution. And so that makes me happy, because I have done a lot of research since 1995, not even knowing that I was going to be involved with this foundation. I started it, but that was not on my radar. I guess I am involved. And yet, I really clearly felt that God told me, study Dred Scott. He doesn't speak in long speeches, he gives you very short little directions. And I said out loud to myself, yeah, I should know more than the average person. So I did. I just began to just start looking at books and Googling, whatever. And I ended up with 20 ring binders full of things that I found. Still didn't know I was going to do this, but ultimately it came about for the 2007 was the 150th anniversary. So instead of watching it on TV, decided to do something about it. And that's how it came about. But since then, we have learned so much, and I'm just really excited to share it with you. So I think we need to get started because we're supposed to wrap up around 6, and I have a lot of things to share with you. And I do a PowerPoint because even though I clearly can do this without PowerPoints and notes, and I don't like notes, but the faces and the people and the places that you will see, I think will burn in your memory, and it will help you take this story with you a lot easier. So for that point, we'll move on and get this show on the road. Before that, though, I do want to thank Professor Sexton for inviting me. When he invited me, I thought, oh, wow, my daughter graduated from here. My husband graduated from Rolla. I'm going to be in trouble because I graduated from SIU Edwardsville. And then Carly said, oh, don't worry, I used to live over there, so she's my backup. And I also want to thank the Michael Middleton Center for Racial Citizenship and Justice. And I see him in the audience and his lovely wife. Thank you for speaking. And then for the Department of Black Studies as well for sponsoring this. Now, I had a chance to speak to, is it Professor Fleming? Dr. Fleming? Okay, just a few minutes ago. And he was very thrilled that you all came out tonight as well. So my daughter is here with me, Sherry, and she always has my back when I least expect it. So thank you for coming with me. All right, so we're going to talk about how the Constitution worked for and against Dred Scott. Now, it's not going to be just the Constitution, it's the whole legal system. And of course, it's based on that. And let's get started. Dred Scott, I call him an original pioneer, even though he probably didn't think so, and he wasn't being called that back in the 1800s. And we don't know his exact birth date, but he felt at some point in his life that he had the right to stand on the claims that were his for his freedom, and this is his story. Dred was born to the family of Peter Blow, and Peter Blow lived in Southampton, Virginia. One of the things we learned along the way in our studies was that Dred Scott and his family actually came through the wife, Elizabeth Blow. And there's all kinds of stories I could tell you about how he got his name, Dred Scott. We don't have time tonight, but if you want to talk about it later, it's kind of fun and funny. But he came through her line, and of course in their marriage, the Blows had 11 children. And these children literally made all the difference in the world eventually in the Dred Scott case. And the picture next to it shows a depiction of Nat Turner, and I think you all know that story. Dred Scott chose the courts. Dred Scott was really a contemporary also of Nat Turner, and they lived down the road from each other in Southampton. Nat Turner took a different route. It didn't turn out well either, but they were neighbors. And had Dred Scott not moved away from Southampton, this is really interesting. It's one of those things that when you're studying and doing research, then you can, well, I like puzzles, so you put 2 and 2 together and you come up with something. And I realized that if he had not moved away, which they did, that he would have been in Southampton at the time of this revolt. And he may have died there, even if he wasn't involved, because they literally killed slaves just because they might have been involved or they might have known something. And so by grace and providence, he actually was moved away from Southampton before this happened. And there's some. Hello. I don't know if I'm doing that or not. Okay, so I just mentioned that they moved, and with the 11 children, they moved off their 800-acre plantation and moved to Alabama, Huntsville and Florence. They lived there from 1818 to 1830. And with most of their children, they traveled with other enslaved persons that were a part of their family. Really would go in about the marker there, but I'll just say that Dred Scott had a first wife, and it appears that she died and was buried there in Alabama. I've spoken to people there, and they say she is. I don't know. So after they got to St. Louis, however, the Blow family didn't do so well. The wife died, and then a year later, the husband, Peter, died. But before they died, they sold Dred Scott to a Dr. John Emerson, who was an Army surgeon. Now, Dr. Emerson had just gotten into the Army. Dred Scott really didn't want to go, mostly because of the ties that he had with the family and now in St. Louis. But of course, he had no choice. And if you are in St. Louis, or if you're from St. Louis, you can see all of the Blow family who are buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery, which is right next to Calvary Cemetery, where Dred Scott is buried. Dr. Emerson took Dred into free territory. First, he was stationed in Fort Armstrong in Illinois, which is near Chicago. And Illinois was free territory. And then later, he was positioned to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin territories. So that's actually Minnesota, and it's the St. Paul, Minnesota area. One of the things I don't normally share, but today I'm going to just pass this on, that they also lived in Iowa for a short time. And this is something that's pretty interesting. I'll go ahead and put it out there since we have such a wonderful crowd. I'm still working on the research of this, but as it turns out that this particular marker is from the Daughters of the American Revolution, who I have great ties with. And it says that Dred lived there with Dr. Emerson, that this was their house. It was Dr. Emerson's house, and he built pretty much a shack, because that's all they ever did, but he built a shack for Dred and positioned him there as a claim holder. So the story that we're putting together is that maybe in Iowa, Dr. Emerson was going to give Dred his freedom and let him live there, and they would come back. And that theory does have some plausibility to it, because people always say, well, why did he come back to Missouri? Why didn't he just stay there in free territory? Because he may have had a home to go back to. But unfortunately, as it turns out, Dr. Emerson passes away shortly after they get back to St. Louis. And when he dies, then that changes everything. But the Indian agent, Major Lawrence Taliaferro, or Tolliver rather is how you pronounce that, had brought Harriet to Fort Snelling also. So at that point, Dred and Harriet met, and they fell in love, and you know what you do when you fall in love, you get married. But Dred and Harriet had a real wedding. They didn't just jump the broom. They may have, but they literally had a wedding, because Major Tolliver was also, aside from being an Indian agent to keep the peace in the territories, he was a justice of the peace. And so it's very telling to listen to the fact that here we have a justice of the peace allowing his enslaved person to marry another enslaved person and to have a real wedding. Dr. Emerson also provided quarters for them as a family under his quarters. They were all in favor of it. There was no problem there. But part of the question is, how does this come about? Well, first, I found out in about the last 2 months that they actually got married at this water tower, and I didn't know that. I've been in this water tower at Fort Snelling. I didn't know they got married there. But they were able to have this public wedding because in free territory, it's very likely that they weren't being called slaves. They were being called servants. And that is something that was maybe a cover, if you will, because they certainly were still owned by their owners. And yet, at the same time, they had privileges, and they also were able to go about as though they were free. They were in free territory. So it was kind of like keeping up the appearances. At the same time, they were also loaned out to other officers for them to sometimes cook or clean. Officers were able to claim that they had these slaves so that they could get extra compensation at the end of the month, even if that wasn't their slave. So everybody was playing the system, okay? All right. But here's the room where Dred and Harriet lived. It literally is under Dr. Emerson's quarters. It's there right now. It looks pretty much just like this. And it is one big room, the main feature being the fireplace, because it's very cold up there. We won't probably have time for this either, but Dred and Harriet had two baby boys, and they died while they were up there. We didn't know that either, but it's very cold up there. And I would have died if I'd been born up there. So I'm pretty sure of it. Plus, there's 8 years between their two daughters, and that's when I'm sure the two boys were born. It is freezing cold. I went to the airport once, and the guy said, "So where are you going?" They're always so nosy. And I said, "To Minnesota." I had a big, heavy mouton coat on. He said, "Well, your coat's going to need a coat." And I went, they're trying to keep me from going because I don't do cold. And I don't think Dred and Harriet did cold very well either. But this was their quarters, so I'm sure that was a roaring fireplace. But I have been there, and I never thought I'd ever get to go there. I heard about it, and it was an amazing encounter. So we're going to just jump a little bit here. The Louisiana Purchase I didn't realize and remember it was this much acreage, but I'm showing it to you here as the states that came out of it. And this is where slavery was prohibited in all of these territories that became the states or parts of states that they were. And because of that, we had laws. The 1807 Missouri Territorial Law became the 1824 Missouri State Law that said if a person was ever on free territory, that map you just saw, if they were ever in free territory, then they would be free forever. That was it. Now, you had to live there for a little bit, but not that long. You couldn't just be passing through. But if you lived there and had residence there, once free, always free was the law. And so if that was your case and you even or went to a state that was not a free state, you were still free. That was the law. Well, Dr. Emerson dies in 1843. They're back in St. Louis, and now his fairly new and young wife owns the Dred Scott family. And this is Mrs. Irene Emerson in her young days. I think the more popular picture that is usually shown of her, she's an older woman. But this is a picture of the old courthouse a long, long time ago. And on the fact that Dred and Harriet wanted their freedom, and I told you a minute ago that maybe they were going to go to Iowa and live and be free by virtue of Dr. Emerson's grace. Well, she wasn't going to have that. Her father was also Sanford, who was one of the leading pro-slavery society people in St. Louis. So that just wasn't going to fly with her family. Plus, there was income involved. And so Dred offered to buy his freedom for $300, and she turned that down. And then there were, other things that they could have added to that. She just said, no. So knowing what they knew and having the support of Reverend John Anderson, who was really someone that helped Elijah P. Lovejoy, and I'm going to just throw these names out. There's a teacher in me that likes to, because I've never had my own classroom, but you're my classroom. And I like to put names out there, and I may not have time to share all of it, but if you don't know who Elijah P. Lovejoy is, please go and look him up. I was at SIU Edwardsville, and that's the name of the library. And I felt really bad after I was graduated and realized I never knew who that man was. And I was in that library almost every day. And it made me angry. So that's why I do what I do. But also, you look him up, he was amazing. And so being the abolitionist that he was, the black pastor who belonged to Harriet, who taught at Harriet's church, they helped them to know what their rights were. And therefore, with this once free, always free, you had to qualify for it, and these were the criteria you had to have. And some of it was rote speech that everybody had to have, like you always had to say you were physically abused, whether they were or not. People ask me, were they? And I can't swear that they were, but there are accounts that maybe that family was abused. The testimony that they needed came from one of the Blow children. So they had what they needed, and on April the 6th of 1846, Dred Scott and Harriet Scott both walked into the old courthouse, and they petitioned to sue for their freedom. This is Dred's mark, and that is his petition, and this is Harriet's mark and her petition. Notice it says Harriet, a woman of color, but not Harriet Scott, because they did not recognize slave weddings or marriages, and there was no such thing in slaverydom. So they would not say Harriet Scott, but she also filed a petition and had her own case going through the court simultaneously with Dred Scott. And that was a strategy I'm pretty sure they came up with, because if anything happened to Dred, they still had the opportunity to save their family, which they had 2 daughters. And I don't often use this, but this is one of the lovely courtrooms in the old courthouse, and likely the room that they may have been in for some of their court proceedings. The Blow children, of which there were 11, but then probably 6 or 7 actually survived to adulthood. Taylor Blow in the colored picture, Henry Blow in the back, and Charlotte Blow in the front. Totally amazing people. We'll talk a little bit about Taylor again, but these are some pretty super people. They grew up with Dred Scott. There's an article that says, "Them Blow boys I grew up with." And so there was this feeling of, well, we have to help Dred. He's been totally done wrong, and whatever we can do, we will do to help. So they oftentimes had in-laws, friends, attorneys, maybe even judges. There was a Judge Scott involved in one of the early cases, and things that they did not have to do that were in the favor of Dred Scott, I was amazed at. We were talking earlier about the Dred Scott case, the Fehrenbacher book. It's about 800 pages long and won a Pulitzer Prize. It's the quintessential Bible for all things Dred Scott on the legal end of it. And these people right here play a very pivotal role in helping Dred Scott and Harriet Scott throughout the years. And those years added up to be 11. April the 6th of 1846, they went into the court. The first time they went in was to file a petition. The first case was in 1847. In 1847, they could have gone in and come right out free, but it didn't work out that way. It didn't work out because, now, you know, I used to work at Brian Cave Law Firm, so they should have hired one of their attorneys because the guy who did represent them did not do his homework. And there was a mistrial due to hearsay. Well, my wife says that Mrs. Emerson owns those slaves, so it's like, really? They threw it out. It took 2.5 years for that case to come back to court. Can you imagine? But in 1850, the second case came and they got their freedom. And I did add this for the first time too. It's not very clear, but at the old courthouse, we do have a copy of the handwritten roster of the 12 white men that were on the jury who gave him their freedom. I should say them because their cases were separate, but eventually they were combined. And the names are hard to make out here, but it's very well known that they did get their freedom at the old courthouse. That was a happy day, but it wasn't very long-lived because it was appealed by Mrs. Emerson and her attorneys. Well, as it turns out, it ends up in the Missouri Supreme Court, and this court fails the Scotts. Now, all of these years, they're giving these slaves with the right criteria, the once free, always free. They're getting their freedom. If they had the right wills, they're getting their freedom. But they said times are not now as they once were. We used to have these cases, and the temperature outside is getting hot, and we just don't know if we really want to keep doing this, and so we're not going to let them have their freedom. But they also were pretty adamant about it, in that what you see on there is almost like a self-curse. They said Missouri is willing to accept the consequences of slavery within her borders. And I don't know if they even knew what they were saying back then, but I think we might be reaping the results of that throughout the years up until now, because that is a consequence. And they went against precedents to make this ruling. So this happened on March 22nd of 1852. After 6 years of your case being in the court, and you are now at the highest court you ever thought you would be at, wouldn't you think you'd be done? Well, they probably thought they were. But then there was this gentleman called Roswell Field, an attorney who lived just down the street on Broadway in St. Louis, whose home is still there. He was the attorney who said, you know, I think that we might be able to do this still. And he found what was called the diversity clause. And the diversity clause says basically that if you're going to sue somebody in another state, you live in New York and they live in St. Louis, then you can bring your case to a federal level. And that's what happened because Mrs. Emerson had decided to move to Boston and find a new husband. And therefore, she gave her business to her brother, John Sanford, who happened to live in New York. So this is where Roswell was genius, and he was able to come in. And so in this particular case, you know, the law was on their side for once free, always free. In fact, that even though his case was valid and legitimate, he could still, and he was a slave, he could still go to the federal level and put his case back in. So as I said, Mrs. Emerson went to Boston. She found a new husband in the person of Dr. Calvin Chafee. And Dr. Chafee was a dentist, he was a congressman, and oh, by the way, he was an abolitionist who found out that his wife owned these famous slaves in the newspaper, and she just didn't think to tell him. So he literally, and I mean literally, was undone because the reputation he had was that he was just so against slavery, and now people were able to mock him because he owns Dred Scott. You gotta be kidding me. And I do have, and I would love to bring so many things. I'm a show and tell kind of person. That's why I say I like to have a classroom. But I have the letters that were written by this gentleman and the other two attorneys that show exactly how Dred Scott was freed. Regardless of what you hear or read in a book, we have their own handwriting and their own letters as to the strategy that they came up with to make this happen, because this man, and I actually do have his real picture, but I like the cartoon, he actually had to get out of this situation. So in the meantime, right before the case is when he finds out, but on March the 6th of 1857, that day that lives in infamy, Justice Roger P. Taney, Chief Justice of the United States Court, he read his decision, and part of it said that they had no rights that white men were bound to respect. What actually happened was, even though he said he read the majority opinion, all nine justices wrote their own opinions. 7 of them were against them being free, and 2 of them dissented from that opinion. Now, Justice Taney decided that at the heart of it all was the matter of citizenship. It wasn't about once free, always free anymore. It was like, you're not even a citizen of the United States. So therefore, the case was basically thrown out. They used the Fifth Amendment because they were saying down on the 5th or 6th line that, that a person cannot be deprived of their property. And so in this regard, they were saying that John Sanford owns Dred Scott, and without due process and without legal backing, he can't be deprived of his property. So this is one of the amendments that they used to validate their position. These are what I call the lowlights. Basically, we may have covered some of them, but they said that neither, in Dred Scott's case, neither people of African descent nor their descendants would ever be citizens, that they neither were before nor shall they ever be. And that's why they threw it out for lack of standing. And activist Judge Style, they went even further, and they said that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Congress had no right to even institute it in the first place. And by saying that, they were saying that no longer will one state come in free, another one come in slave, and back and forth. Now, they're just going to all be slave states, and that's the end of it, period. They also said the Northwest Ordinance from 1787 was unconstitutional, and that meant that all the territories west of the Mississippi, all the free territories, now could be slave territories. So these and other reasons are why it is considered to be, and still perhaps, one of the, if not the worst decision ever rendered, with all these different opinions being weighed in on. So one of the things, though, that is interesting, that the decision was not based on truth. In St. Louis, we have a documentary, just a brief one, about 17 minutes, done by the History Channel when the 150th anniversary came about. And in there, there's an attorney, a professor attorney, who said that basically it was just a bald-faced lie. He just used that word, that it was a lie, because it was known and is well documented that at least 5 states allowed native-born black males to vote as far back as 1787. Well, that's the beginning of the Constitution. And these states were Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, and North Carolina. And they did this up until 1835, when they were just starting to get the heat about it. It's like, well, maybe we shouldn't let them vote, just like that. So they were able then to participate in ratifying the Constitution. And no one thinks about that. So freeborn and free blacks were flourishing in the North and voting, and this was a right of citizens. So for them to say that blacks never were, nor shall they ever be, nor their descendants be citizens, was not true. And even those who were free blacks lost their citizenship rights with the Dred Scott case. So then the question became, well, what did they do? And of course, there's several answers to that. And so I did find Harry Jaffa, who I really did not know, but he was an American political philosopher, and he offered an interesting point, which was the distinction between the Constitution's philosophy and its compromises, because we all know that when the Constitution was written, they had to compromise. There were a lot of changes made to Jefferson's writings. There were a lot of changes made to John Madison's writings. Even Madison, in his case, he agreed to some of the changes. I think Thomas Jefferson was like, I want everything in there the way I had it. But what he had in there was a blatant discussion against slavery, and that is not in there. But in this case, he's saying that the philosophy is that, all men are created equal, and on it goes, and this is for everybody, this is America. But at the same time, they compromised and allowed slavery. And again, that compromise was to keep the Union, or to get the Union in that case. The other person I thought was interesting was an educator and a political figure called Seth Low. And I just recapped a small part of something that I found, which kind of tied into the gentleman before, that the progress and evolution of the past 19 centuries has been the result of a great force which came into the world, that of Christ. Although in the whole world, in the whole Bible, there is not one word prohibiting slavery. Still, the principles inculcated in the Bible were responsible for the abolition of slavery. So I'll just let that kind of sink in. But what they're both saying is they said one thing and they did another, or it appears to be one way, but this is what really came out of it. And when we start studying these topics, we have to think like that, or we have to at least look around and find out what else has been done or said and what really lies at the heart of the matter. So this particular gentleman was the president of Columbia College, and I think I have on here that he was the second mayor of New York, but I think it was Brooklyn. And he died, remember this date, on 9/17/16. 9/17 should sound a little familiar to you, though. Another person that I came across was an artist, musician, Charles Gaines, and this is contemporary. And he had comments on the Constitution. I'm going to read those to you. He is doing a musical piece, and I really haven't seen it, but I believe it is done, because this was in 2020. And he said Tawney used that as a basis for his decision, that the people who wrote the Constitution were all white. But it turns out that they weren't. It turns out that a whole bunch of black people were involved in writing the Constitution. And this is recognized on paper and documents, that black people who had voting capacity in the state level participated in the writing of the Constitution. So the minority opinion asks, how can you consider this country to be made for white people when black people were involved in creating it? The issue of the role of black people in creating the United States, for me, is huge. And Tawney knew it. And he goes on to say a few more things. So I'm sharing this because I found it and I know of this individual. I will continue to research that, but it is true that, yes, there were people involved. And another individual sent something to me that said that there were 35 Moors, the Moorish people, 35 black Moors who were involved. So there's a lot behind the history that we don't normally see. And yet I always say check, check, and double check. A lot of people will say that's not true. Okay, so Dred and Harriet now are in a situation where the court has said you will not be free and nobody else will be free, and the whole nation is erupting into, oh my God, the Dred Scott decision, how horrible. You'll recognize on the left again, Taylor below Dred Scott. Below him is Montgomery Blair. For those of you who are from St. Louis, the Blairs were from St. Louis. His brother Francis Blair, notable person in St. Louis. The Blair House in Washington, D.C. is named for them, where the ambassadors stay. And then this is the actual picture of Dr. Calvin J.B., the abolitionist. And so these people got their heads together and decided, how will we free Dred Scott and his family? What they ended up doing was coming to, well, first they had to go with the law. The law said you can only free someone if you're in the same state with them. Well, Dr. Chafee was in Massachusetts, and Sanford was not trying to free him, but he was in New York. So how do we do this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to get Dred's family back to the Below family. And then he will for $1 accept that and get $1,000 bonds for both he and Harriet. And once he owns them, he is doing that with the express purpose of freeing them. And that's exactly what happened. And how they did that is also fascinating. I didn't bring the framed version. I was trying to travel a little light. But can any of you think of what document it might have required for them to make this transaction? Any legal heads in here? Okay, you've got some property, you need to sell it, and you need to do it really quickly. There's a hint. It was a quitclaim deed. And this is a copy of the quitclaim deed. This deed says that for $1, Dr. Chafee, Mrs. Irene Sanford Emerson, and her daughter, Henrietta Emerson, all quitclaim Dred Scott's family to Taylor Blow. And this instrument was the legal instrument that had to be used to effect a proper transaction so that they could get their freedom. And on May 26th of 1857, just shy of 3 months of the decision, Dred, Harriet, Eliza, and Lizzie were free in St. Louis, Missouri. This because of the help and the compassion and the care and even still the sacrifices of the Blow family. Now, one thing that happens in, a lot of people don't know this, especially if you're not from St. Louis or if you haven't heard me speak, but the girls were hidden away from anywhere as short as 3 months to 2 years, and no one knows where. And I think I've figured it out. So as soon as I know, I'll let you, because it is a major puzzle, but it's a great story. And I'm feeling 90% confident that I know where he hid his girls. He said he could get them back at any moment if he wanted to. So that meant that they were right under their noses. And that was pretty smart too. So I'm very excited about that, and I'm hoping that by next spring, I'll be sharing the information I have on that. So I'm going to move along a little quickly now. Dred Scott decision becomes a major catalyst for the Civil War. And I know we got a lot of Civil War scholars in here, so we all understand what happened there. And yet, Dred Scott lived 17 months a free man, and he died on September 17th. 1858, on what became Constitution Day. So to me, I got goosebumps when I found that, because I didn't know, of course. Nobody thought about it. We didn't know. And nobody made the correlation. So 17 months, September 17th. I don't know about that number. The number means victory, but Harriet died on June 17th of 1876. So the 17 was a big number, and that number means victory. And so ultimately, they did win. They did win. But Dred's life was one so much so that when the Reconstruction Amendments were approved, ratified, etc., Dred Scott's name was attached to them. You will sometimes find them called the Dred Scott Amendments. The 13th, which abolished slavery, the 14th, which overturned the Dred Scott decision, as it were, and then the 15th that gave black men the right to vote. And that photo, or the cartoon rather, is a picture of the first black man voting, Thomas Gandy, and I think he has a third name, and I can't remember it, but a very famous picture of the first black man to vote. So the Dred Scott Amendments was another part. And of course, you probably all know that the 14th Amendment, and it says all persons born or naturalized shall be citizens. So this was a big thing, a big move. And then we have that pesky 3/5 clause. Well, the 3/5 clause, it is misinterpreted sometimes to mean, and people, of course, would rightly be offended to say, I am not 3/5 of a person, and that I'm not 3/5 of a citizen. But basically, it was really about representation. And there, we don't have time to do this now, but there's a lot of discussion as to whether 3/5 was good or bad, depending on how you look at it. It was good if you wanted your representation to be less so that you could help determine what the laws were going to be, and maybe in some cases that might have tempered slavery. And then on the other hand, they felt like, well, you have an advantage because you're getting to count your slaves. So it's very controversial, but it is an interesting perspective that it does not mean, it never was intended to mean that the individual was only 3/5 of a person. And that's a hard message to get across because people are offended, and I don't know if they want to stay offended, but if we read the text and if we go into the context, that is not what it meant originally. So some of the legal moves for Dred Scott that worked for him were the Declaration of Independence, which declared rightly so that all men were created equal, and that would include him and all slaves. And then the once free, always free doctrine was a very positive thing that allowed him to go into court. The diversity clause allowed him to go beyond the Missouri Supreme Court and take his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the jury trial even was a positive thing because given that that was the law and that was the instruction, they got their freedom. The Three-Fifths Clause could be on this list because if it helped temper the representation of those who wanted slavery, then it might have held it at bay a little bit. And then those amendments we just looked at were the ones that came out of his case for which he gave a good part of his life. Those that worked against him were the Missouri Supreme Court decision of 1852, the Buchanan conflict, which we didn't talk about, but President Buchanan actually knew ahead of time what the decision was going to be, and he and several other the judges kind of got their heads together and agreed that, well, yeah, you do that. That sounds good to me. That sounds good to me. We'll settle this issue once and for all. And then when on May 4th of 1857, 2 days before the Dred Scott decision, he gave his inaugural address, and he said, and we're about to get the Dred Scott decision in a few days, and whatever they decide, that's just going to be just fine. I'll go along with that, knowing full well that it was going to be a pro-slavery decision. And then the Tawney decision, of course, did not go well for him. The Fifth Amendment did not get used in his favor, and again, the Three-Fifths Clause, depending on how you want to look at it. So these are different ways that the law, the Constitution, and individuals have affected the Dred Scott case. So we're going to wrap up here quickly. This is the only statue in the world of Dred and Harriet Scott, and I'm so thankful that we were able to raise $250,000 to get this statue outside the old courthouse June 8th of 2012. It's 10 years old this year. The old courthouse is closed. If you come to St. Louis, don't be disappointed just yet, but they're renovating it, and Dred Scott's going to have a whole wing on the east side for his history, where before he was only on the wall and just a picture. So that's a great improvement over the years. And this is something we're very proud of. 1852, March 22nd, the Missouri Supreme Court denied the freedom of Dred Scott and said things like, we're not going to do what we used to do, and we're going to accept these consequences, we don't care. And for a couple of 4 years, maybe, we worked to try to get that renounced. And in April of 2021, that was accomplished. So in Jefferson City, right here, we were able to get a renunciation of the 1852 decision. And that was a big day for us. It was a good thing. Part of our program is something we call Dred Scott Presents Sons and Daughters of Reconciliation. And I'm going to fly through and just show you some quick pictures of what the foundation is doing. And we'll open it for questions, I'm sure. What you're looking at here is the first gathering of this group of sons and daughters. And from left to right, you have descendants of Martin Luther King, Martha and Thomas Jefferson, Sally Heming and Thomas Jefferson, Dred Scott, John McClain, the justice on the case of Dred Scott, and Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederate. This was our first panel in Marshfield. I think we asked somebody about Marshfield earlier today. And we work frequently together to share our stories, to impress the histories, to correct the histories, and to share about what the future can hold. This is a member of the Blow family. Right now, that's John LeBourgeois. He's a sweet guy. He's actually not very well right now, and I hope I get to see him in the next month. But John and his family have been very supportive and involved in several of the programs that we've had, including the celebration of gratitude for the renunciation, which we held this March, for March 22nd, and that was 70 years ago. Charlotte Blow was his grandmother, and she's one of the ladies that I told you helped the family as they were going through their trials. I thought you might find this of interest to the legal community because we were asked to be the morning session for the National Judicial College in St. Louis a couple of years ago, and the new face that's on here is Kate Tawney Billingsley. And a wonderful story of how she has written a play about the descendants of Dred Scott. And I was there for the opening at the Actors Studio in New York. And everything from there forward just fell in place. I wish I had more time. And here we have a gathering of Dred Scott, Plessy, and Ferguson, and Brown, the three seminal cases, civil rights cases. We work together. We actually have Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson Davis in this picture. We were in Louisiana on a project. But we've had a conference, reconciliation conference in St. Louis with this group. And here I'm working with Charlie Tawney, and we are in Richmond, Virginia. What a day, what a day, what a day that was. And we are being introduced in the Virginia House of Legislature there. Charlie is a great nephew of Justice Tawney. And I'm going to skip this for a minute. We were at the Jefferson Memorial with Bernice King, Alveda King. This is Alex Haley's grandson, and Will Ford III, who's not in this picture. There was a ceremonial foot washing at the Lincoln Memorial to descendants of slaves by descendants of slave holders. And the man who was my foot washer was a descendant of the first colonial governor. And this is a day-long program. It was very moving. It is actually on YouTube. Charlie Tawney issued an apology, public apology, which he did not have to do, but he did on the 160th anniversary of the Dred Scott decision. And over between us and then off to the side, you see the statue of Tawney. And this was just about 3 weeks before they took that statue down. But it was a historic day for all of us. And we worked very closely together. Charlie and I have traveled quite a bit, as well as he, God has a sense of humor. Our foundation wanted to do a strategic plan, and Charlie just happens to do strategic plans for nonprofits. And so he did it for us, pro bono, and that was a part of the beginning of our relationship, along with the play. That's our statue. And Dred doesn't have a stamp, but somewhere in this building there's a petition that if you will sign it to help us influence the powers that be, that Dred Scott needs a stamp and not Bart Simpson. Harriet is buried in Greenwood Cemetery, and this happened in 2009. Beautiful headstone for her. We now know exactly where she's buried. Dred Scott was unmarked at Calvary for 90 years. Yeah. He died in 58, so he was unmarked at Wesleyan Cemetery, but when he was moved by Taylor Blow, who paid to move him, before they abandoned that cemetery, he paid money to move Dred Scott and bought 3 grave plots, because a black man can't be buried next to a white man. And Dred Scott laid unburied until 1957, when Charlotte Blow's granddaughter bought this headstone for him. And that's me and my little brother, my mom and dad being shown by Father Edward Dowling where Dred lay. And there's a book coming out on him, December, January timeframe. Very fascinating story, all of this. But now, one of the things Father Dowling said, and we'll be wrapping up right now, he said, here's where Dred Scott lays. If anyone ever wants to do more for him than this humble headstone, feel free, but at least you know where he is. And so fast forward to 2022, COVID, etc. We are going to put this headstone over Dred Scott next spring. This will be over those 3 grave plots, which now we can use, 10 by 10 black granite and 9 feet high. And Dred Scott's grave, which we can hardly find because it's down here, will be up there. And we'll be able to share his story on that granite marker. And he is among the top 3 people who were asked for their graves out of 300,000 graves at Calvary Cemetery. And so we just would like to see him be honored in that way so people can learn about him. So I think I'm at the end of the program here, and we thank you for your rapt attention. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. That was just fantastic. We're going to have a reception after the event, but we have time for some questions. And it's the Kinder Institute tradition to have students ask the first question. But I think you have a comment. Yeah.
Just very fast. My mom knows who James Madison is. She said John Madison because that's her dad's name.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. I didn't even hear myself say it. Yes, James Madison, the father of the Constitution. We're in a coffee book on the, A More or Less Perfect Union, which came out by Judge Ginsburg. And in that copy book, I'm standing next to James Madison at the Constitution Center. Thank you.
Okay. questions. Catherine first, yep.
Hi. I was kind of wondering if you could explain more what reconciliation looks like and kind of what involvement the foundation has
Okay, I'm sorry, which museum are you referring to?
the courthouse museum.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we actually are. We have quite a relationship there. They're part of the original group that helped us to celebrate his life and to commemorate the 150th anniversary. So we've obviously kept a very close relationship with them. I'm on the Jefferson National Parks Association board, which is one of their entities. And the new wing is it's still gonna be another year, maybe year and a half off. But there are things that they asked me to do. I think I'm gonna be a voice over an animation, as well as just the colors even. At one point I saw the color palette that they were using and I thought, I don't think that's the one to use. And they said, okay, what do you like? And I told them. So I hope I see that. But either way, yeah, we are working very closely together. I appreciate you asking that. And reconciliation for the future, I mean, who knows? But I really do believe that the best way to engender that is what I used to call, I still do, by using the R word. And a lot of people think the R word means race, but it means relationship. And what we encourage people to do is to build relationships. Charlie, for instance, has a program he calls Breaking Bread, and he lives up in the Northeast, and he admits that growing up, he wasn't around any black people at all. But he, now and then he'd see someone on the job, but this just wasn't his world. So he came up with Breaking Bread, which he suggests that people will find someone they trust. Like in his case, he had a black person he knew and felt comfortable with. He asked them to come to his house, bring their spouse, and have dinner. And he did get that connection through a white friend, but the white friend said, I know somebody that might work, and so they got together. And that was a good experience. They had a lot of fun, and he likes to joke and say, well, I figured that this person was going to be, a really staunch liberal, and it turns out that the woman was a liberal, but the husband was conservative. And so that surprised him. Then they found another couple, and the couples have just grown. So they have this big gathering now of interracial couples who just get together to try to know each other. And it's been extremely rewarding. So I can't tell you what it's going to look like in the future. I know I'd like it to look like, but I think we have to take those baby steps and start connecting through relationships to make that happen. Thank you.
Other questions?
So I'm from St. Louis, and specifically I grew up right next to Jefferson Barracks, and I didn't know until recently that Dr. Emerson's family actually owned land right next to where I grew up. So my question, and obviously there's, history is steeped deeply everywhere. So how can we help make people be more aware of the places that they're in and what impacts those places have had?
Okay, well, that's a good question, and I thank you. Let me clarify something. You said Dr. Emerson's family, and Jefferson Barracks is an interesting place. Dred Scott's youngest daughter was born there. My mother was a nurse there. My parents are buried there. And it seems far away, but it's really not. And so when you said that, and you said family, I know that Mrs. Emerson, his wife, if that's what you're referring to, I'm not sure, her father owned the land around Lambert Airport. So you're talking about some other land. I don't know about that. But to answer your question, there's a marker program going on in St. Louis where politicians actually, and I won't mention, but a famous sports team and others of us are looking for ways to put markers in places where they wouldn't be. If we put them everywhere they needed to be, you'd just be tripping over them everywhere you went. You just would, because history is everywhere. I found out one day that I worked and parked my car almost on the same street where Dred and Harriet lived. And for the 10 years I was parking there, I didn't know that. So I think we need to turn the television off, maybe get off the boat, and do a few other more constructive things, open some books, and search for those things. Like I said, when I give out a name, like Elijah P. Lovejoy, or Geyer, or Shoto, then go find out who those people are. If you see a street name that looks kind of weird, like we've got one near our house, and we can't even pronounce it, and we're wordsmiths. And why is this weird name on the street? Find out who those people are. And that way, I think we'll be able to teach each other. Tell your friends, tell your children, tell your teacher, tell everybody. But let's share what we know, too, not just keep it to ourselves. Yeah, thank you.
I have a lot of questions about the women in this
Yeah.
story.
Yes.
And I know there's far more information that you have time to share with us, but I would love to learn more about Harriet. You mentioned how she and Dred met, but what her life was like before that, what her life was, especially after Dred passed away. I am guessing that she lived quite a bit longer than he did.
She did.
And I'm curious what her life was after that time.
Okay, great question, and I'll try to make it, full and brief. But Harriet, as it turns out, they're both from Virginia, but we know we can trace her from Pennsylvania because that's where Major Tolliver was from. So he brought her from Pennsylvania. I was told through oral history that her mother prepared her to be a cook and a laundress, which she was primarily a laundress, because she wanted her to have skills and be wanted and be needed, and everybody needs their clothes washed. So she was prepared, and that's hard work too. It was very hard work, but that kind of runs in our family. And so she came to Fort Snelling. People did a variety of jobs there. I can tell you about Dred and some things he did there that I never would have believed. And so while she was there, and I think that her personality was such that she said, we're having a wedding. That also kind of runs in the family. We're going to do it this way. And that's why they had that wedding. But then she was a mother, and there's a book called Mrs. Dred Scott by Professor Lee Vanderbilt. Some of you may know of her from Iowa University. And I had her manuscript when it was this thick, and the book is 500 pages. You can't write 500 pages on Harriet, but about 250 of them are, and the rest are references. But the 250 talk about her times and the places that she was in, and it kind of theorizes a little bit around her life because we don't have as much detail as we would like. But she did live. She was 20 years younger, about 20 years younger than Dred, okay? And she died in 1876. But she got to see her grandchildren. And one thing I will share briefly on a family note is that we found out through our genealogy that we thought there were 2 grandchildren, one being my grandfather and his brother Harry, John and Harry. We found out that there were at least 4 other children that all died very young. And 2 of those babies, one is buried with Dred Scott and one is buried with Harriet. So if you go visit their graves, you're really visiting the grave of a grandparent and a grandchild. So these things come out in the compassion that the family had and the closeness and those things. But really fast, and I won't be able to go through this whole thing. I'll do it later if somebody asks me. But the youngest daughter, her story is very fascinating too. Lizzie. And I have documents, and I had a theory, and I am the only one, aside from my aunt, because she told me, who knew her real last name that she changed it to hide. And because of that, we were able to find her death certificate and different things like that. So, yeah, the women have good story. And Harriet certainly had a lot to do with hiding those girls away. So we'll chat about that hopefully next time. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Harriet's not in there, but my daughter's reminding me that there is a book called The Blows of Yesteryear that talk about 4 of the Blow women. And one of them, Charlotte, is just like my hero. And so they were very close. They worked together. Again, they supported the Scotts. So there is more to learn and more to know. But thanks for asking about that, because it does seem like they don't get their just due. All right.
Okay, before we give a very well-deserved round of applause to Lynn Jackson for a wonderful, wonderful Constitution Day talk, And then before we break for our reception out there, can I just reiterate the encouragement for everyone to sign the petition? So the Dred Scott stamp, we mustn't have Bart Simpson with a stamp, but not Dred Scott. Lynn, thank you so much for a wonderful, very memorable Constitution Day talk.
Thank you.
And the adrenaline probably gets you through it.